All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Thank you everyone for joining tonight. This is the third and final webinar in Sea Grant's Reef Fish webinar series. As a quick reminder, if you missed either of our first two webinars and would like to rewatch them at any time, they will be posted in the coming weeks on South Carolina's Sea Grant's YouTube channel. My name is Ryan McMullen. I'm going to be your host for this evening's presentation. I currently serve as Sea Grant's South Atlantic Reef Fish Extension and Communication Fellow, where I work with Sea Grant offices throughout the South Atlantic region, from North Carolina down to Florida, to support projects that advance stakeholder understanding of the issues management and ongoing research of our federally managed reef fish species. For those of you who may be less familiar with Sea Grant is a federal university partnership program that supports coastal, marine, and Great Lakes communities through extension, education, industry training, and applied science programs. This includes providing science-based training and resources to fishermen on issues such as fishing sustainability, risk management, and stock status and health of your commercially and recreationally targeted fisheries. If you're curious about the work that Sea Grant does in your state and in your communities, feel free to reach out to me either in the chat, or you can send me an email after the webinar, and I'd be happy to connect you with your state's Sea Grant office. So as a whole, this Reef Fish webinar series exists to highlight a small selection of the impactful research that Sea Grant supports and provide commercial, recreational, and for-hire fishermen with additional science-backed insights into their fishery. These webinars are meant to be interactive, so we encourage participants to submit questions for our Q&A segment that will be held at the end of the talk. So I want to quickly provide an orientation to some of GoToWebinar's Q&A features. You should all see the following interface on your screen. If you'd like to leave a question at the end, you can always click on this button here that looks like a hand icon, and we will unmute you from our end. And at that point, you can click this red button here to unmute from your end and ask your question verbally. Or at any time during the presentation, you're also welcome to leave a question in the text box below. So last week, we heard about how fishery scientists in the South Atlantic are working to understand ecosystem level changes and how they're affecting our offshore fisheries. Tonight, we speak with Creed Branham to learn about his research studying the movement ecology and life history of Greater Amberjack as part of the Greater Amberjack Count Research Project. Creed earned his bachelor's degree in marine biology from the College of Charleston in 2020 and has worked closely with both recreational and commercial fishers throughout his career, seeking to bridge scientific research and real-world fisheries. Creed is currently a PhD student in the Fisheries and Movement Ecology Lab at Louisiana State University's Department of Oceanography and Coastal Sciences. His research broadly focuses on the movement and migrations of large marine fishes in the Gulf of Mexico and Atlantic Ocean, with particular interest in how human-made structures influence fish behavior and movement dynamics. So without further ado, I'm going to make Creed our presenter and unmute him for his talk today. Thank you, Creed.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. Hopefully everybody can see my screen well now. Yeah, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to come and talk about some research that I've really enjoyed doing over these last couple of years, and I'm really excited about. Before we get started today, I'm having a bit of lag. Okay. Yeah, before we get started today, I just want to give a quick overview of kind of what we're going to be covering. First, I want to talk a little bit about what animal movement ecology is and how we study it. Then I'm going to cover some background on Greater Amberjack. We'll discuss the history of the fishery and some pertinent biology. Then we're briefly going to touch on what the Greater Amberjack Count actually is and some of its goals. And then finally, we'll wrap it up by focusing on the present study, going over our main objectives and some of the interesting results that we found. So I am first and foremost an animal movement ecologist. And essentially what this means is that I study the mechanisms that drive when, how, and why animals, in my case fish, move or migrate. A good way to kind of conceptualize this is called the movement ecology paradigm, shown in this figure. It describes how both the internal state of an organism and the environmental factors around it drive it to move. But an organism's ability to move is then dependent both on its ability to navigate, and in the case of fish, its ability to move through water. And the result of all these components is the actual movement path that an organism takes. In my research, I primarily focus on 3 of these components. First, the internal state of the fish, like its maturity or its desire to reproduce or feed. Also, the external factors like salinity and temperature that might drive a fish to move to or from a particular place. And then finally, that resultant movement path that a study species actually takes. Another important component we have to consider in this field is the scale of this resultant movement path. These scales vary widely. At their broadest, these movements might be hundreds or thousands of miles. A classic example we can kind of think of is the salmon migrating hundreds of miles from its natal stream to the ocean, and then hundreds or thousands of miles out into the ocean to forage. But movements may occur at much smaller scales and are still important even if they're not these grand migrations that we often think of. In the case of this goby, it may only move inches or a couple feet around a habitat patch throughout its life, but it's still of great importance to fisheries to understand movements across the scales. Understanding the movements of marine fish species is a critical component of effective fisheries management. At larger scales, movement data are useful for identifying movement pathways that are critical to migration or connectivity, and these can help us understand how anthropogenic barriers like dams may impact species. These data also help us quantify rates of emigration and immigration to and from populations, which in turn informs how resilient stocks may be to depletion. Populations with high exchange can quickly replenish locally depleted areas, whereas isolated populations are often slower to recover. Large movements can also help us delineate a species' range, and then in turn are necessary to effectively draw management boundaries. But while these broad-scale movements are important to fisheries management, it's also crucial to consider movement behaviors and habitat use at smaller scales, like I was mentioning earlier. These patterns of habitat use can help us understand localized vulnerability to fishing pressure, and then can be used to identify important habitats. This is a study that's an example of this from the dry tortugas. Using telemetry, these researchers measured the habitat use of each of these 3 important fishery species on a reef, and then identified the spatial extent, which is shown by the color polygons in this figure, of each species. And then with these data, they assess the effectiveness of implemented marine protected areas in the region and then the potential for those species to be exploited in turn. So in our lab, the technique that we primarily use to study the movements of fishes is called acoustic telemetry. You can kind of think of this as a 2-part system. We have a small transmitter that'd be like this little black cylinder here that we implant into a fish. That transmitter sends an acoustic signal over and over again at a predetermined interval, and this acoustic signal contains a unique identification number for that individual fish. The other part of this system is the acoustic receiver, which is this larger black cylinder here. When a fish with one of these tags in it swims by a receiver within its listening range, it'll record the detected identification number. We can then retrieve the receiver and can tell when a fish showed up, how long it was there, and whether it made any movements based on detections of multiple receivers from point A to point B. Typically, as researchers, we try to deploy these arrays of acoustic receivers locally in areas of interest for a particular study. But for fishes that make long movements, often the the extent of a single researcher's acoustic receiver array isn't enough to capture those movements. And so to get these data, folks like us are members of collaborative telemetry networks, which facilitate the sharing of acoustic data between researchers within a region. Acoustic telemetry is becoming increasingly popular as a method of studying fish movements. It kind of blew up in the early 2000s, thanks largely in part to the increased miniaturization of electronics and then the improvement of battery technologies. And these advances have allowed us to tag smaller organisms and then get much longer deployment times for our tags. And as such is an important technique that's employed worldwide in both terrestrial and marine systems. So as you might imagine, deploying equipment in the marine environment can prove quite challenging. Often we have found that the easiest way to deploy a receiver and have some hope of getting it back is to affix it to some sort of hard structure, often man-made structure that's already out there in the ocean. This usually means attaching to things like buoys, navigational aids, artificial reefs, employing scuba divers who can swim down and securely fasten our equipment to these hard structures. But sometimes these structures do not exist in an area that we're trying to study, or the water depth is too great for divers to access. And in those cases, we have to use specialized pop-up receivers that we deploy with sacrificial anchors and use specialized equipment to remotely deploy and retrieve our gear. All right, moving into the star of the show, Greater Amberjack are a really neat fish that are pretty well known here in the Southeast, but are actually distributed worldwide. They function as an important predator, popular in both recreational and commercial fisheries. But their life cycle starts here as a free floating egg that ultimately hatches into a free floating planktonic larvae. Once the larvae is large enough to swim on its own, it will start settling to floating structure. Usually this floating structure is something like sargassum grass. It's really common here, but it can be driftwood or even floating trash. And they live in this floating structure for 30 to 60 days, and then they undergo this crazy habitat shift, moving from the surface to the seafloor, and typically associate with all manner of natural and man-made reef structures. But what we don't know really is how they use these reef habitats, how often, or whether or not they move between them, or even whether or not they make migrations. None of these things are really well understood, but they're critical information to effectively manage the species. Like I mentioned, Greater Amberjack are globally distributed. So on this map, everywhere you see a darkened border is somewhere where we have a record of Greater Amberjack occurrence. However, the only areas that we have at least some understanding of their biology is restricted to the colored lines in the map. In the Gulf, we typically associate Greater Amberjack with structures like oil rigs or natural reefs that are scattered around. The little information that we have on their movements here suggests that they're mostly resident and may make short distance movements between reef patches or within the local area. Along the Atlantic coast, we know even less about their movement, just that they're relatively common along the continental shelf using natural and artificial reef habitats. But what is really interesting about this species is that there's been some studies done elsewhere in the range. And we know from these studies, this is an example from Taiwan, that amberjack are absolutely capable of making long distance migrations. And that during these migrations, as adults, they may entirely abandon that preferred seafloor reef habitat and move across open ocean water, much like a pelagic fish, like a tuna. But in the US, we manage Greater Amberjacks as two separate stocks. That's managed as the Atlantic and the Gulf stock. Historically, both stocks were depleted starting in the 1980s, You can see that in these two plots here, depicting the levels of biomass and spawning stock over time. So when we recognized that these populations were being overfished in the late 20th century, we implemented regulations in both regions. And since the late 90s, the Atlantic stock has recovered, but the Gulf stock is still depleted. And this is especially concerning because we keep implementing more and more stringent regulations in the Gulf in an attempt to recover the species. And they just don't seem to be, we're not seeing a response in the population of amberjack in the Gulf. And so what this tells us as fisheries biologists is that we may be missing something, and therefore we need to get a better understanding of greater amberjack biology to hopefully manage the fishery better. And so that, in part, is what spawned the Greater Amberjack count. This started in 2021, and it's a collaborative effort between universities and state agencies across the Southeast to both enumerate and provide updated information on greater amberjack. The project has several goals. The first project goal is to calculate an absolute abundance estimate of greater amberjack in the Southeast. And essentially what this means is we're trying to figure out how many amberjack are in US waters using a combination of video and hydroacoustic surveys. The project is also working to provide updated age and growth information, as well as other biological traits to support and supplement our current understanding of the species' life history. Third, we're studying the genetics of the species throughout their range in the United States using fin clips, hoping to understand better their mixing rate between populations. And finally, last and certainly not least, the project is studying the movement ecology and residency patterns of the species to hopefully to answer some of the other questions about their behavior. And then this is the piece that we're going to be focusing on for today's talk. So for the movement component of the greater amberjack count, we have three primary objectives. Our first objective is focusing on that smaller scale that I was talking about earlier, comparing residency and habitat use of greater amberjack between the Gulf and Atlantic coasts. The second objectives look at movement behaviors on a broader scale. We wanted to first identify seasonal movement patterns and connectivity across the range of the greater amberjack in the US. And then perhaps most importantly, evaluate the exchange and mixing between these two populations, the Gulf and the Atlantic. So objectives, we deployed acoustic receivers throughout the Southeast coast. That's what we see in this figure here. Each triangle on this map represents a place that an acoustic receiver was at some point during the study, and is therefore a place where an amberjack could have potentially been detected. Some of these receivers are from members of our group, but a lot of them are maintained by outside researchers who we are connected to through those collaborative telemetry networks that I mentioned earlier. We divide our study area into three regions, the Western Gulf, the Eastern Gulf, and the Atlantic, and then try to distribute tag deployment evenly throughout these regions. In total, we deploy almost 500 tags, making this one of the largest telemetry efforts in the Southeast. This is a similar map to the one I just showed, except for in this one, instead of places where we could have detected amberjack, these are locations where they actually showed up. Our most robust detection data came from the Western Gulf, where we had great receiver coverage and some other ongoing projects that we could leverage data from. But we still got good detection data from each region. Okay, so here we're going to move a little bit more into specific results to address our original objectives. I won't really go into a ton of detail on methods for the sake of this talk. Instead, I want to just kind of cover the general research questions that each analysis was sort of trying to address. But if anybody has any specific questions about methods or a specific analysis, I'd be happy to answer those at the end. So just keep those in mind if they come up. So the first thing we look at is residency. And residency essentially just asks the question, how long does an amberjack stay in one spot? And then once we answer that question, we can break it down further and ask whether this pattern changes by habitat type or geographic location. In a similar vein, we wanted to look and see if there were seasonal trends in habitat use, asking if amberjack change how they use habitat or which habitats they show up on throughout the year. And then finally, we had a separate component that sort of emerged partially through this project, where we wanted to examine the use of greater amberjack and whether it varies between habitat types. We'll start with our seasonal habitat use and residency results. We found that residency was significantly different between the Atlantic and the Gulf, but was similar between both regions. And what this means is that on average, amberjack spend about twice as long on a particular site in the Gulf compared to the Atlantic. When we break it down further by habitat type, it becomes apparent that amberjack also stick around on artificial structures about twice as long as they do on natural reef. Moving into our seasonal analysis here, I just want to take a second to explain what's going on in these plots, because we're going to have a few more of them as we go through later in the talk. On the x-axis of these plots, I just have day of year, so 1 through 365. And then on the y, we have the probability of detecting an amberjack at a given habitat on a given day. So this value ranges from 0 to 1, where at 0, there's a 0% chance of detecting an amberjack, and then 1, there's a 100% chance of detecting an amberjack on that day at that habitat. And what these plots tell us is how the affinity to a certain habitat type might change throughout the year. In almost all region habitat combinations, we saw a peak where amberjack were most likely to be detected in the late winter and early spring. But conversely, amberjack were least likely to be detected in the late summer or early fall. Moving into our depth use piece. So as a component of this study, we examined depth use of greater amberjack off of Louisiana using specialized acoustic tags. These tags are equipped with a depth sensor so that each time we detect a fish, we also get the depth that fish was at the time of detection. And so with these data, we investigate the effect of vertical relief on the habitat use of greater amberjack, where vertical relief is essentially just the extent of the structure off the seafloor. And so we tried to pick 3 representative habitat types of varying relief for this study. The first of which is an oil rig. An oil rig offers continuous vertical relief from the seafloor to the surface. Then an artificial reef of moderate relief. In this case, it was about 20 meters of relief off the bottom. And then finally, a natural reef, which presented almost no relief and was primarily comprised of just low-lying rock rubble. In this study, we thought that there were 2 scenarios that we might be able to observe. The first of which would be that there is no effect of vertical relief on the habitat use of amberjack, and we would see them using the same restricted range of the water column in all 3 habitats. Alternatively, we might expect amberjack to use an increasing range of the water column based on the amount of vertical relief at the site. And what we actually observed was, in fact, the second scenario. The plot on the left is the actual data from the study. This shows the distribution of detections throughout the water column. So on the top, we have the natural reef. And here we saw that amberjack spent most of their time near the seafloor in like the bottom 10–15% of the water column. At the artificial reef, they were distributed higher in the water column, but still primarily in the lower half of that water column. But finally, at the platform, amberjack were well distributed throughout, and this kind of suggests that the sheer amount of vertical habitat provided by a platform allows them to use much more of that water column. Okay, so let's move kind of from that smaller habitat scale to the broad movements that we observed. First, we wanted to see if we could identify which factors drive amberjack to move. And then from there, we wanted to map which pathways amberjack use to move or migrate along the coast, if any. And finally, and again, maybe most importantly, we wanted to see if Gulf and Atlantic amberjack are connected by adult movement pathways. So we'll start out with our factors influencing movement behavior. This is a plot similar to what I showed earlier, except for here what we're trying to model is the likelihood of an amberjack making a movement between point A and point B, rather than before we were just looking at the probability of detecting an amberjack anywhere. So our y-axis here is still from 0 to 1, but here the x-axis is showing different factors that we found influencing the likelihood of an amberjack moving. Most important in all models was day of year, and so what this suggests to us is that there's a strong seasonal component to the movement behavior of amberjacks. The timing of these movements was variable between regions, suggesting that there may be like localized environmental factors or differences in temperature regimes that cause them to move differently at different times of year. Additionally, in both Gulf regions, we saw that size of fish was important, where larger fish tended to move more frequently, perhaps as a result of changes in internal state or maturity. This is the same kind of modeling as before, except for now our y-axis has changed. Instead of looking at probability, another way we can look at movement behavior is how fast a fish is moving, the rate of movement. So again, in these models, we saw that season is the most important factor driving movement. And between the Atlantic and the Western Gulf, we see that fish tend to move most quickly in the late winter and early spring, which is coincident with their spawning season. Fish size was also important in these models, but that relationship is a little bit less cut and dry than it might have been before. Okay, let's move into population connectivity. I think this is where it gets really cool. These are sort of the results that at least get me the most excited. This is a simple map of just every observed movement made by amberjack in our study. And you can kind of see some trends, but you can also tell that the data are quite messy. The points are overlapping and the arrows get a little bit lost. And so we use a technique called network analysis that allows us to clean this up and look at the trends a little bit more broadly. So what we do in the network analysis here is combine the less informative local movements into a single point. Those are shown here. And what's left are large, impactful movement pathways that we can analyze and compare. Those pathways are depicted by the gray lines in the plot, with colored dots representing hubs of connection, so points of importance. And then the color of the dots is meaningful too. Dots of the same color are highly connected, or at least dots within that group are more connected to one another than they might be to dots of different colors. But what's really interesting about this plot is it shows how connected greater amberjack are along the Atlantic coast. So about a third of fish tagged in the Carolinas made some kind of movement to South Florida. And 2 of those individuals made international movements too. One fish tagged in North Carolina was later detected in the Bahamas, while another individual tagged in North Carolina was detected in South Florida and then ultimately recaptured in Belize, which represents a straight line distance traveled of over 1,500 miles. Conversely, in the Gulf, we saw none of these really long distance movements, and most of the movements that we did observe were local or within state. Only about 2% of fish that were tagged in the Gulf made any kind of interstate movement, and those that did only moved to the adjacent state. And then finally, and again, perhaps most importantly, no connectivity was observed between the 2 regions, where no fish in the Gulf ended up in the Atlantic, and none of the fish in the Atlantic were ever detected in the Gulf. So after we had kind of our big, beautiful network, we wanted to break it down a little bit further to see if there were any seasonal trends in connectivity. And so these plots are essentially the same as the network before, except for we filtered it down to only movements that occurred within a season. In the Atlantic, we saw that there was a seasonal trend to connectivity, where most of those long migrations were made either in the winter or the spring. And there was very little there was no interstate connectivity and even low within state connectivity in those Atlantic states during the summer months. Conversely, in the Gulf, connectivity really didn't change throughout the year. And again, we still see no large movements. So I think if I was to try to summarize all these results into a single sentence, I would say what I have here. Greater Amberjack exhibit distinct movement behaviors between the Atlantic and the Gulf basins. It's pretty simple. At the habitat scale, we saw residency was much lower in the Atlantic compared to in the Gulf, where similarly, movement rates and distances moved were much higher in the Atlantic. And so when you combine these two results, it kind of suggests that Amberjack and the Atlantic are just constantly bouncing between habitat. They go to habitat A, spend a little bit of time there, move to habitat B. Whereas those in the Gulf tend to stay put with their higher residency and lower movement rates. They just stay put. We observed these substantial seasonal migrations in the Atlantic. And based on the timing of these migrations and historical reports of potential spawning aggregations in the Keys, they suggest that these are probably reproductive movements, some kind of spawning migration. Conversely, our data from the Gulf shows that even though movement probability might change during some times of year, they're probably just moving around locally to reproduce rather than making spawning migrations like they might elsewhere in the range. Finally, the lack of observed connectivity between the basins supports the current management paradigm that treats the Gulf and Atlantic as separate populations. The major caveat there, and I didn't get into it here because it's part of a separate project, but I mentioned that larval phase where amberjack are drifting around. And so it's possible that even though connectivity is low or non-existent in adults, genetic connectivity is facilitated through larval transport. And to answer that question, we're going to need to dig a little bit deeper into some of the other life stages of the species to really get a complete picture. I got to thank all my co-authors, of course, and their institutions who have helped me maintain receivers and have gone out and tagged fish. Of course, none of this is possible without the funding from the Mississippi-Alabama Sea Grant and then the Sea Grant Office at large. And then finally, cooperative telemetry networks are crucial in studies like this. We use data both from the Florida Atlantic Coastal Telemetry Network, FACT, and then the integrated tracking of aquatic animals in the Gulf, ITAG networks, to provide us data for these results. And it's a crucial part of this kind of research. So I'd like to thank all of them. And with that, I'm done. I would be happy to answer any questions.
Awesome, Creed. Thank you so much. I think that was one of our more interesting presentations. I think you were able to present all that information really, really well. So just as a reminder to everyone, you're welcome to either raise your hand and then I can unmute you from our end to ask a question, or you can always leave it in the questions tab of your GoToWebinar dashboard. While people put those questions in the chat, Creed, I'd love to know a little bit more, as I know it's not your specialty, but the rest of the Greater Amberjack Count project, it goes beyond movement ecology, correct? So what are some of those other components that you're looking to help inform with your work?
I mean, the first and foremost, it's a count. So the enumeration of amberjack is the major project goal there, which of course our group has worked on, and of course folks from all the other states. But that's coming along well. The movement data might not directly inform that, but it is helpful in understanding how populations might shift over time. And then even within the context of like a big survey effort, like the Greater Amberjack Count, or even some of the NOAA surveys like G. Fisher, it's important to know how these fish move because we can't sample everywhere all at once. And so understanding how frequently a fish might move or whether populations shift from one side of the Gulf to the other is informative in survey design, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with that kind of note you mentioned with survey design, I was curious if attaching the receivers to existing structures, like you mentioned, does that bias your sampling area at all? And then kind of tying into that, I was curious, in some of the figures you show, there's less detections in the fall and winter. And I was curious if that indicated that, amberjack are using, potentially less, high relief habitats or going offshore, or kind of what do you make of that dip in detections?
Yeah, that's a great question. To answer your first question, does attaching to structure bias your results? It does. It would, in the sense that if you're trying to do some kind of habitat suitability, or trying to do an analysis where you need zeros, you need non-occurrences, it probably does bias your results. But in the case of movement studies like this, what it really does is it increases your ability to gather data, is what it does, because amberjack associate with structure, and it's already a great big wide ocean. And if we just deployed, say we only had 50 receivers available to us in the study, and we deployed those randomly, whether they were on structures or not, just in a random pattern, the odds that you would detect a single fish swimming through the ocean are so low that we kind of have to focus on these areas, or these habitats of high affinity for our study species, and then we can look at how they interact with those habitats. But to your second point, what it does is it does kind of bias you, in the sense that you only know what's happening on these habitat types. And with amberjack, I think we have a pretty good idea that they spend most of their time on natural or artificial sites. And so what's really going on, I think, with that probability of detection thing, is that they're just moving around a lot more in the spring. And so if you have some spatial domain with some receivers scattered throughout it, you're more likely to pick up fish if they move more frequently. Just, as a game of odds, if they're bouncing between the habitats, eventually they're going to hit your receiver. Whereas in the fall and the winter, they might just kind of stay where they're at. And it's possible they're using different habitats during that time too. And we can't really answer that question for sure.
It's definitely a complicated issue. One of the attendees is curious about how climate change may play a role in altering migration patterns. I think especially of the Atlantic population that was shown to have those really, really, dramatic migration pathways. So can you speak at all on how climate change may be affecting these patterns, and also what that might mean in terms of overall population stability?
Sure, yeah. That's a really good question. And I think what a way to look at that question would be to look at the differences between the Gulf and the Atlantic. In the Gulf is a lower latitude, typically warmer basin. And so amberjack don't really feel the need to migrate. It seems like, at least. It seems like they just reproduce where they're at, because this habitat is suitable year-round. Conversely, on the East Coast, North Carolina is pretty much at the upper end of the thermal tolerance for most amberjack, especially in the wintertime, not necessarily in the summer. And so one could imagine that as the ocean warms, the need to migrate to reproduce might be lessened on the East Coast. And the other factor that might feed into that too is we know that the Gulf Stream is slowing down, and amberjack migrating from North Carolina to South Florida might be doing it because of temperature, but they also might be doing it because if you're an amberjack in North Carolina and you have a pelagic larvae that then becomes a pelagic juvenile, and it's 90 days until that individual is ready to settle to the habitat. If you cast that larvae into the Gulf Stream in North Carolina, it's going to be in Nova Scotia by the time it's ready to settle to adult habitat, and it's not going to survive. And so that's probably another reason that they need to migrate to South Florida. So anyway, all that to say that as climate change affects temperature regimes and Gulf Stream dynamics, I could see a shift in movement pathways.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that stresses the kind of importance of continuing to study the system, right? As climate certainly leads to really broad scale changes, migratory species like amberjack is certainly going to be kind of at the forefront of how we understand those changes. Another question coming in here, looking about, if overfishing has affected amberjack movement trends. And I think maybe another way to look at this is, are there certain, just thinking about my understanding of amberjack fishing is obviously the fishing intensity is a lot stronger in regions of Florida, for example, as opposed to Georgia and the Carolinas. Do you notice any sort of change in behavior, or can you anticipate any sort of change in behavior based on fishing effort, or is that not really a part of their movement?
That's a good question. I think more than changes in behavior, you might expect to see differences in distribution, if that makes sense. So in the Atlantic, it might be less so because, as we know, these fish move around a lot, bouncing between habitat patches. But in the Gulf, where fish tend to remain resident, I couldn't show it in this talk, but we have some fish that stick on a single platform for hundreds of days, if not a couple of years. And so in regions like that where the fish aren't moving around a lot, there is a high potential for them to become locally depleted due to fishing pressure. And so those would be areas near ports or like well-known fishing locations. It's something that happens with fish everywhere, but it certainly could happen with amberjack. Conversely though, the good news is that larval stage offers an opportunity for habitats to be renewed, I suppose, or replenished with amberjack once a year, even if at that particular habitat the numbers of amberjack are low.
With that, continuing along that logic of kind of the specific habitat used by Greater Amberjack, I guess I'm curious if habitat restoration or habitat management, how central is that to species like Greater Amberjack, knowing that they are capable of moving if habitat isn't suitable, but clearly they're also capable of moving these great distances specifically to access, habitat regions, whether it be in Florida or whether it be in, I believe Belize, you mentioned as another example. So do you feel like habitat management would have those defined positive benefits on Greater Amberjack, or do you think there are species that's a bit more adaptable?
That's a great question. I think amberjack are habitat generalists. Broadly speaking, are habitat generalists. And so targeted restorations to things like coral reefs in the short term, I don't imagine affect Greater Amberjack all that much. But the caveat to that is that they forage on reef fish and that they do need some kind of reef habitat to exist. And so you might have a bleaching event or something, or an artificial reef or a rig get removed, and it's no biggie to the amberjack because they can move to an adjacent structure and be fine. But over time, as you lose that, or as you lose those forage spaces, it absolutely would have an effect on the species.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just as a general question, again, I think this is applicable to folks who may be a little bit newer to kind of the offshore fishing side of things, but can you describe kind of briefly the reasoning for that separation between a lot of species between the Gulf and the South Atlantic? That's something we see in a lot of other reef fish as well as in a lot of other, migratory fish as well. Is that primarily because of the Gulf current, or is there other factors leading to that division?
That is a really good question, and it's hard to say. I don't have a good answer for you there. I think that in a lot of fish we see that they just evolve differing life histories based on the environments in which they're grown. And the Gulf and the Atlantic are just both quite different environments, even though spatially they're close by and there is no restriction that would keep one from moving into another. I think that there's just certain life history strategies that innately constrain individuals of a population to one side or the other. It's a bit of a guess, but that's what I would say.
Yeah, no, totally. It's certainly, again, one of those questions that needs to be kind of continually visited as climate change tends to lead to those disruptions in the Gulf Stream. I have another question here, just about specifically in Mississippi waters. A few of the maps you showed seem like there was less amberjack in Mississippi state waters as compared to, neighboring states. And is that due to a lack of habitat or structure, or is it the bathymetry? Or was it simply a lack of sampling effort in that area?
That's a great question, and that's a caveat worth mentioning. So the dots on the map are great, but the dots on the map don't necessarily indicate where amberjack are, right? That's in a lot of ways, those are restricted by our sampling design and our methods. And you're spot on with that case of Mississippi. We tagged some amberjack in Mississippi, and we had some equipment deployed in Mississippi, but the acoustic receivers that were deployed there were only out for a short amount of time. There were some external factors that made it where we had to pull them, and so our data from the Mississippi-Alabama region really is not robust, even though, of course, we know that there are a lot of amberjack there. And for example, we had the one fish that was tagged in Mississippi and ended up moving to Louisiana. So we know that they're there, but in this particular study, that was a bit of a blind spot for us.
Yeah, and Creed, correct me if I'm wrong, but obviously the focus of your work has always been on movement and connectivity. I'm sure if you were to look at fisheries independent or fisheries dependent data of greater amberjack landings, I'm sure you would see a much more equal presence of greater amberjack in Mississippi state waters.
Yeah. The count component of this project isn't my primary responsibility, but I can speak to that a little bit. I think that based on the data that I've seen, density of amberjack is relatively similar throughout the Gulf, and we certainly counted a lot of amberjack in Mississippi.
Absolutely. We have another question here kind of about the tagging efforts. So I know this was primarily an acoustic tagging study. Curious if you considered other mark recapture, for example. I know is a method that a lot of anglers are familiar with. Also looking at processes like environmental DNA to look at presence absence. Were those considerations in this project, like kind of early in the scoping phase?
They were, and they were employed. So we had some folks from Mississippi, I think. They did some environmental DNA at the beginning of this project. I believe that paper is published. I wish I could tell you the title, but I don't know it off the top of my head. So, but they did some environmental DNA to try to measure presence absence of amberjack, and then we also tagged about 1,500 amberjack with conventional mark recapture tags. A lot of those. Well, all of the amberjack that got a acoustic tag also got a conventional tag as well, and then we tagged about 1,000 more. The primary goal of that was to look at exploitation. So how frequently are amberjack taken out of the fishery? And that's a separate analysis that's being done by Matt Catalano at Auburn, and hopefully it'll be published here before long.
Right. I think it was one of our last questions here. Folks are interested just on the economic and ecological importance of the fish. And I know that's a little bit, on the applied aspect compared to your project, but can you speak on either of those two aspects of greater amberjack?
Yeah, absolutely. On the economical side, it's historically been a commercial fishery. There's not too many anglers for whom it is a primary target, but it is certainly a bonus, when you can get a few hundred pounds of amberjack to sell. From the recreational side, they've often been maligned as a food fish, and I do my best to change folks' opinions on that because personally I love eating amberjack. But they're also such a fun fish to catch that charter captains often use them as a bit of a day saver, on a slow day. They can go catch some amberjack and at least wear out their clients a little bit and show them a good time. So there's certainly a relevant fish to both commercial and recreational fisheries. Ecologically, I think they're really interesting because they serve this kind of intermediary role that there aren't too many, if any, fish in the Southeast that function this way. As a reef predator, they're a reef predator that kind of acts like a fish, right? So, we think of our typical reef communities consisting of our snappers, small grunts, little angelfishes and butterfly fishes. And those are kind of the forage base, and then you might have reef sharks or groupers that are the primary reef predators living in that structure. And then in the similar depths, in the pelagic zone, you might have king mackerel and bonita that function as pelagic predators. But amberjack are sort of this intermediary where they associate to reefs, but they don't live in the reef. And as such, I think that they're kind of a trophic link maybe between pelagic communities and reef communities. And there's really not many other fish that we have, at least in the Southeast, that do that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important piece of them being kind of these trophic links. Just as context, my undergraduate work was a lot on mesopredatory sharks in South Florida. So well familiar with, the importance of these mesopredators. And I think it's also fascinating looking at these huge migrations, the role they are as a nutrient vector as well. If they think about, they go up north, whether it be to capitalize on springtime, productivity, or whether just to follow a food source. But then they do travel back to the south where they're able to sort of re-enter that in the food chain, whether it be through their waste or through their consumption, right? So I agree with you. I think they're super underappreciated. I think like species like Greater Amberjack are super important to the function of our nearshore reefs.
I agree.
Awesome. Well, Creed, thank you so much again. And thank you all again for attending this evening. As I mentioned previously, all 3 of the Sea Grant Reef Fish webinars will be posted in the coming weeks on South Carolina Sea Grant's YouTube channel and on the South Carolina Sea Grant website. I encourage everyone in attendance to check out your state's Sea Grant website, where you may find additional resources on topics like working shoreline development, habitat restoration, educational resources, as well as ways that students and community members can get involved. So with that being said, thank you all again one last time for attending this year's Sea Grant Reef Fish webinar series and for your continued interest in the science behind how we manage our offshore fisheries. Have a great rest of your evening.